Believe me, I'm not lying to you.
I hid everything from him, the night, what I felt, the pregnancy. I thought I could leave without consequences, but when I tried to walk out of his life, for good, he cornered me with his gaze, too close, too dangerous, and said, his voice low, as if the decision was already his, like it or not, you're staying. A pause, his eyes on mine, this baby is mine, and that's when I realized I never had control of this story. Hi, I'm Lena, and this story is just beginning. Chapter 1. The Warning She Didn't Hear. It was the kind of morning that seems prepared for something good. Clear sky, good coffee right from the start. The beige blazer fitted just right, and the contract signed since the day before. Double salary, the position I'd wanted for 2 years. Office 20 minutes from home. I headed down to the street with my portfolio organized in my bag, and the feeling that everything was falling into place. The first call was to Lorenzo. It's always to Lorenzo, since we were 12, when we shared an apartment too small for 2 teenagers with too much temperament, and I already knew his voice was the first one I needed to hear when something important happened. Good or bad, urgent or mundane, him first, and the world after. Some childhood habits you don't abandon, and that one never seemed like a problem to me. He answered on the second ring, like he does when I'm the one calling. I got the job, I said, without preamble, because with him I never needed a preamble. Signed yesterday, Viscari Holdings. The silence that came after lasted 3 seconds. I counted them without meaning to, by the automatic reflex of someone who knows her brother in every possible register and knows how to distinguish the silence of celebration from the silence of restraint. That was the second one. Viscari, he repeated, and the name in his mouth sounded different than it had in mine. Viscari Holdings, yes, I confirmed. And there was already something different in my tone too, a thread of attention that appeared before I decided to pay attention. You know them? I know the owner. And that's when I heard the serious register, the one Lorenzo uses rarely and always with reason, which is the most irritating part of him as an older brother. It wasn't alarm or drama. It was the calm, low voice of someone about to say something he'd rather not have to say, but will say anyway, because that's how he works with me. Talk, I said, and he talked. Not everything. I understand that now, months later, with the bitter benefit of someone who survived her own stubbornness. There were parts of the story Lorenzo kept for reasons I only came to understand much later, and he told me what he thought I'd be able to hear without quitting the job. But enough. Dante Viscari, 35 years old, owner of an empire that went beyond what the CEO title could contain. Power that wasn't measured in contracts, but in conversations never recorded, and problems that disappeared before becoming problems. One of the most respected men in the Mafia. A womanizer by choice. Not the type who collects names, but the type who collects moments and never stayed with any woman for more than one night. Alessia, Lorenzo said, and I recognized that tone too. It was the tone of someone weighing every word before releasing it, choosing the right order so I'd really hear. This man is going to notice you. Men like him always notice. I laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was the automatic laugh of a younger sister who grew up hearing her brother turn manageable situations into imminent catastrophes, and who learned, over 15 years of living together, to calibrate the alarm by the track record. Lorenzo's track record included forbidding me from riding my bike on the street at 13 and thinking I'd get lost on a solo subway trip at 18. The man has a specific talent for overestimating danger. Lorenzo, I said, with the patience I reserve exclusively for him. I'm an executive assistant. I'm going to organize schedules and prepare reports. You're going to walk into his office every day, he responded, without raising his tone, without picking up the pace, which was more worrying than if he'd shouted. I'm going to work, I said. There's a difference. For you there is. For him maybe not. I stayed silent for a second. Not because he convinced me, but because there was something in the quiet certainty of his voice that reached me in a way I didn't like noticing. Lorenzo wasn't being dramatic. Lorenzo was being precise, and I knew how to tell one from the other when I paid attention. You're scaring me about a man I haven't even met yet, I said. I'm preparing you, he responded. And then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough for me to feel the weight of what was coming, he doesn't seduce like a normal man, Ale. He doesn't need pickup lines. He uses presence, proximity, time. You'll realize you're different before you understand why. And when you understand, it'll already be too late to pretend you didn't notice. I wanted to say he was exaggerating. Wanted to say I was grown, that I knew how to take care of myself, that I'd survived things more complicated than a boss with a reputation as a ladies' man. And I said all of that, with the firmness of someone who believes what they're saying, because I truly believed it. It's not about interest, Lorenzo said, before I finished. It's about the way he operates. You might not be interested and still feel something. They're different things. The silence between us lasted a few seconds. The sun had risen a bit more while we talked, and the street below was busier, and I gripped the phone tighter than necessary without realizing I was doing it. "Promise you'll call me if you feel anything strange?" he asked. His voice had that underlying layer that's only brother, only protection, with no judgment embedded. I took a deep breath, and then said, with the honest conviction of someone speaking the truth, as they see it in that moment, "I promise I won't feel anything." I believed that when I said it, without irony, without arrogance, without the shadow of doubt that should have been there and that I would have been able to notice if I'd listened to my brother with a little less certainty and a little more attention. I called Sophia, who screamed with satisfaction and turned everything into a celebration before it even started. I didn't mention Lorenzo. I filed his warning away in that internal drawer I use when the world asks more than I'm willing to process at once, and kept walking with the naive feeling of a door about to open. I wasn't wrong about the door. I was just completely wrong about what was on the other side of it. 10 floors up and 20 minutes away, Dante Viscari had my file open on his desk, standard procedure for anyone with access to his calendar. I found out later that he didn't finish reading it, closed it halfway through, pushed it aside, and sat in silence looking out the window. Marco said it was the only moment in years when he couldn't read what the boss was thinking. Chapter 2. The Encounter. The Viscari Holdings building was glass and dark steel, straight lines, the kind of architecture that says, "We don't need to prove anything with such elegance that it proves everything." The receptionist checked my name, separated the temporary badge, and paused for half a second before handing it over. "Good luck," she said, just that, with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that's technically cordial, and at the same time carries no real warmth. I clipped on the badge and headed to the elevator with the feeling that those two words carried something I chose not to examine. The 10th floor was quiet, not empty, full, the silence of a place where people speak softly, because they learned that's what you do. The assistants in the hallway measured me with the honest gaze of people calculating how long I would last. I knocked on his office door, walked in, and stopped. Dante Viscari didn't look up from the documents when I entered. He stayed with the pen in his hand, his head slightly tilted over the paper, completely still, and completely aware that I was there, which was different from not knowing. He knew I was there. The stillness wasn't distraction, it was tactics. He was making me feel the weight of the room, before deigning to occupy it with me. I stood at the door and counted. 45 seconds, with the controlled anger of someone who recognizes tactics and refuses to let it show on her face. Long enough to smell the wood and leather, to understand that he didn't need a word to make clear who was in charge here. And then he looked up. It was slow, with the calm of someone who's not in a hurry because he's never needed to be. His eyes reached me and stayed, not the quick, assessing look of a boss checking out a new employee, but the lingering and completely calm look of a man who just found something interesting and has no rush to look away. Something moved inside me, fast, involuntary, prior to any conscious decision, the kind of reaction that appears before you have time to choose not to have it. I thought of Lorenzo in that exact second. He's going to notice you. Men like him always notice. I straightened my posture. I decided, right there, in that moment, that I wasn't going to let this man know his look did something inside me. I was going to be professional, competent, and untouchable, and I was going to maintain that with tooth and nail if necessary. "Romano," he said. His voice was low, direct, without unnecessary inflection, and reached me with a precision I didn't expect from 2 syllables. "Yes," I answered. "Sit." It wasn't an invitation. It was an instruction. And the difference between the two wasn't in the word. It was in everything around it. In the tone, in the posture, in the eyes that didn't look away while he said it. I sat, opened my laptop, positioned the folder on the desk, took out my pen with the automatic gesture of someone starting a meeting like any other. And then I looked up at him, because that's what the situation called for, because it was professional, because I wasn't going to pretend there was anything in that room that would stop me from looking straight ahead. He was still looking at me, with that calm that was starting to irritate me in a way I couldn't quite name. "You read the job scope," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did," I answered, "and I prepared a summary of priorities for the first week, if you want to review it." A short pause. Something crossed his gaze, too fast for me to identify, but it crossed. "I don't need to," he said. "I already know what the priorities are." And then he went back to the documents, as if the conversation had ended the way he'd decided it would end, without consulting anyone about it. I kept looking at him for half a second, the half second I allowed myself, just that one, and then opened my laptop and started working. The war had begun, and the most irritating part was that he didn't even seem to know he was waging one. Or worse, he knew, and simply didn't consider it necessary to make an effort yet. I spent the morning learning the office rhythm. At 11, when he called my name without looking up, I already had the document ready before he finished the sentence. He read it, paused a second longer than necessary. Right, but I saw it. I saw the moment his eyes landed on me a second before returning to the paper, with that quality of attention that wasn't professional, and that he wasn't trying to hide, he just wasn't announcing it. And I understood, with a clarity that made me uncomfortable, that Lorenzo hadn't exaggerated about absolutely anything. This man had noticed me, and the part I didn't want to admit until much later, as I headed home that night with my laptop under my arm, and the noise of the city around me, is that I had also noticed him, in a way that was going to be very hard to pretend hadn't happened. Chapter 3: The Forbidden Connection. The first 2 months were a cold war that started before I realized it, in the first look, in the first instruction, and in the meetings that never appeared on the official schedule. Last-minute encounters with closed doors, men without badges who left without leaving a trace. In those details, it became impossible to pretend that Dante Viscari was just a CEO. There was a name that appeared more than once in those meetings, never said out loud near me, but recorded in a document that passed through my desk by mistake and that I read before returning. Sorokin. I didn't know who it was, but the way Marco collected the paper from my hands, quick, without comment, with a look that was instruction and request at the same time, told me it wasn't someone I wanted to know. On my part, I had established the rules clearly. For myself, which was the only audience that mattered, professional, competent, untouchable, especially after realizing that office hid much more than contracts and reports. After the meetings that didn't exist, the names that weren't recorded, and the silences that said more than any explanation, I delivered everything before the deadline, anticipated problems before he asked, solved what others left for later, with an efficiency I knew was good, and that I refused to use to impress him, which was an important distinction to maintain, even if only I knew about it. He was demanding in the legitimate way. High standards, no apology for it. Direct, almost cruel in his objectivity, like someone used to dealing with consequences others can't even imagine. When something wasn't up to standard, he'd say it. When I exceeded what he'd asked for, he didn't comment. But he noticed. I saw that he noticed. If he were just demanding or just cold, I would have settled in. The problem was the attention, the way he read everything and everyone with a control that didn't come from impulse, but from calculation. He didn't react. He decided. And he saw me with the same precision I read him with, which made it impossible to treat him like any other boss. The details started accumulating at the end of the first month, so discreetly that I only realized it when it was too late to pretend I hadn't noticed. The coffee was the first. I had the habit of getting mine before entering the office in the morning. Black coffee, no sugar, in the smaller cup. One Monday, when I arrived at the break room, there was already a cup prepared with my name on a post-it stuck to the side, with the precise handwriting of someone who writes like they speak, direct, without ornament. I stared at it for 3 seconds with an expression that must have been funny, because Carla, the assistant from the finance department, passed by me at that moment and said, without stopping, without turning her face, "Welcome to the club." I didn't ask what she meant. I took the coffee, walked into the office, and didn't comment on anything. He didn't comment on anything either, and the coffee kept appearing every morning, prepared just right, without me ever having asked, and without him ever having mentioned it. It was a small detail. The problem with small details is that they accumulate. The second detail was the green dress. I wore it rarely, reserved for days when I needed to feel solid inside. It hugged my waist in a way that was elegant without being excessive, and fell straight on my hips with the kind of line that doesn't ask for attention, but receives it anyway. On a Thursday in the second month, I wore it because there was an important presentation, and because I wanted to feel how I feel when I wear it. Firm, present. Dante canceled the 11 o'clock meeting with no stated reason. He stayed in the office all day, and during that entire day there was something different in the quality of attention he gave me. Not more obvious, not more frequent, but with a different weight, as if the volume of something had been adjusted 1 degree higher without anyone announcing it. It was the eyes that lingered a second longer before returning to the paper. It was the infinitesimal pause between him calling me by my last name and finishing the instruction, as if the interval existed for something beyond what the sentence needed. It was the way, when I approached the desk to deliver some document, the space between us seemed to have a different density than the space anywhere else in the room. I didn't wear the green dress the following week. It took me 2 weeks to admit to myself the reason. The third detail was what knocked down any rational argument I was still trying to maintain. At the end of the second month, there was a business dinner with executives from a partner company. I was present by function, managing the logistics, invisible in the productive way that executive assistants learn to be in these contexts. Everything was going well until one of the executives, a man of about 50, 2 drinks ahead of good sense, made a comment about me as I was walking away from the table. I didn't hear the comment. I knew what it was from what happened after. The next morning, Dante terminated the contract with that company. The official reason, recorded in the minutes by Marco, with the expression of someone writing fiction that everyone agreed to treat as fact, was long-term strategic divergences. Marco Vitale, who had been watching everything since day one with the eyes of someone mentally documenting a story that hasn't ended yet, smiled for the first time in months. It was a small, quick smile. He wasn't trying to hide it or announcing it. He was simply letting it exist, which in Marco's vocabulary was equivalent to a long and detailed comment. I found out about the terminated contract by accident, in an email copied to me by mistake. I sat in front of the laptop for a long moment with that information on the screen, feeling something settle inside me in a way I didn't ask for and didn't know how to deal with. It was warmth and alarm at the same time, mixed in a proportion I couldn't separate. That night I called Lorenzo. I said work was great, that the boss was demanding, that everything was within expectations. Lorenzo asked, as always, "Are you okay?" "I am," I said, and I didn't say anything else. I saved the rest for Sophia, which is where the rest always ended up. Because Sophia doesn't judge, doesn't panic, and doesn't say I told you so. Sophia listens, processes, and says exactly what she thinks, which is sometimes worse, but at least it's honest. The third month was when the Cold War stopped being cold, not in a declared way, but there was something that had changed in the atmosphere of that office, a tension that lingered in the air after most people left, that existed in the hallways when he passed too close, in the silences that lasted a second longer than necessary between one instruction and another. It was the constant awareness of where he was in the room. It was knowing, without looking, when he got up from his chair, when he approached, when he stood too close to my desk for a moment that stretched beyond what the situation called for. It was the way he said my last name, Romano, 2 syllables that in most people's mouths are just a last name, but in his voice arrived with a cadence I had started to recognize as something completely different from a way to call me, as if the last name were a boundary he chose to cross every time he pronounced it, slowly, with the calm of someone who's not in a hurry, because he's already decided he's going to get where he wants to get. I pretended not to notice. It was all I had left. And then came the afternoon of an ordinary Wednesday. Ordinary until it wasn't anymore. I was leaning over the conference table, organizing documents for the next day's meeting. It was the end of business hours. The room had emptied gradually, and there was that specific quality of silence that only exists when a large space loses most of its people, but doesn't lose all the tension they left behind. The light was lower, the hallways quieter, and I was focused on the chronological order of a report that had been assembled wrong, which irritated me enough to keep me focused instead of paying attention to the rest. I heard Dante's office door open. I heard the footsteps, and I know them now. Their rhythm, the specific weight they have against the wood floor, the speed that's always the same except when it's not. My brain had collected this information over the last few weeks without asking my permission, and I had stopped fighting this fact, because fighting it wasn't helping anything either. The footsteps approached in the direction of the bookshelf at the back of the room, which was behind the conference table where I was working. The room was large. There was enough space to pass by any route. He passed behind me, and then, in a second I can still reconstruct with a precision that bothers me, his hand brushed my back, very lightly, the tips of his fingers on the curve of my hip, for less than 2 seconds, with a lightness that could be an accident if there weren't so much awareness in it. If the footsteps hadn't decelerated 1 exact degree at that moment, at that specific point, and accelerated back afterward, it wasn't an accident, and we both knew it. I straightened slowly, with the documents still in my hand, with the heat of that touch spreading through my body like something that doesn't ask permission to arrive and doesn't fade when you decide it should fade. He was already on the other side of the room, with his back turned, opening a folder on the shelf with the absolute calm of someone who did absolutely nothing, shoulders open, precise movement, no sign of anything. The silence between us had a different texture than any silence that had existed before in that room. I finished organizing the documents with the precise movements of someone controlling every gesture, because letting any of them escape would be admitting something I wasn't ready to admit yet. I collected the folder, grabbed my bag, and left the room without looking back, because looking back was the only thing I knew, at that moment, that I couldn't do. I felt the heat of that touch for hours. Later, at the restaurant where I met Sophia, I told her. I didn't plan to tell. The words came out before the decision, which is the way important things always come out when you're with the right person. He touched me, I said. Sophia put down her glass. How? On my back. passing by. I picked up my wineglass, very lightly. "Alessia," she said, with that voice of someone about to say an obvious thing that the other person doesn't want to hear yet. Men like him don't do anything without meaning to. I knew that. I'd known it from the moment it happened, with that irritating clarity of someone who realizes something at exactly the wrong second. But hearing Sophia say it out loud made it real in a way I'd spent hours trying to avoid. "And then," she said. "And then nothing," I answered. "He's my boss." Sophia looked at me for a long moment, with the expression of someone who has a lot to say and is weighing which part to say first. "For now," she said, and ordered more wine. Chapter 4. The Dangerous Seduction. In the 5th month, Dante stopped pretending it was professional, not in an obvious way, not in a way I could document or name in an objective sentence, but in a way I felt on my skin, with that inconvenient clarity of someone who's already spent too much time learning to read the silences of a specific man and can no longer pretend not to understand them. It started in the elevator. We got in together on a Thursday afternoon, after a meeting that had run past schedule, and had left the office with that residual energy of something important just finished, just the two of us. He pressed the ground floor button, the doors closed, and the small space of the elevator suddenly seemed smaller than its actual dimensions. I stood facing the doors. He stood behind me. His scent arrived before anything else. Wood, amber, and some note underneath that has no name in any bottle I've ever seen, but that my brain registered weeks ago and filed away with an attention I hadn't authorized. I fixed my eyes on the closed doors with the determination of someone using concentration as a shield, and knew, with that part of me that's honest, even when the rest doesn't want to be, that the shield was failing. 3 floors left, he moved closer. 1 centimeter. Just 1. But in such a small space and such dense tension. 1 centimeter is the difference between manageable distance and completely new territory. "You wear this dress on purpose," he said. His voice was so low I felt it more than heard it, arriving at the nape of my neck before reaching my ears. It wasn't a question. It was a statement said with the calm of someone who's already reached a conclusion and is just communicating it. I didn't turn. I answered, looking at the doors, with the most neutral tone I could assemble. "I wear what I want." "I know," he said, and paused for exactly 1 second before completing. "That's what bothers me." The doors opened. I stepped out first, with the confident stride of someone who knows where they're going, and only when I turned the corner and left his line of sight did I let the air out of my lungs all at once, in a way I'd been holding since the 3rd floor without realizing it. He didn't move for 2 seconds before stepping out of the elevator. I didn't see it, but I knew. Just like I knew where he was in any room, I knew when he stood still, and I knew what those 2 seconds meant. The trip to Milan was scheduled 2 weeks later. There would be meetings with Italian partners, a packed schedule, logistics I had organized with my usual precision, separate suites on the same hotel floor. I registered this with relief, and then got irritated with myself for registering it with relief, because the relief implied I'd considered the alternative, and considering the alternative was exactly what I'd decided not to do. The first day was long and technical. In one of the sessions, I identified a flawed premise in a Milanese executive's projection before anyone else in the room, and said so. The room fell silent. Dante turned his face in my direction. He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes that I stored without meaning to. That night, I was in the hotel bar with my laptop open, and the honest intention of working another 2 hours before sleeping. Simple dress, hair down for the first time in days, a glass of wine I'd ordered as a reward for the long day. He appeared. He sat next to her, not across the table next to, his arm centimeters from mine, the heat of his presence arriving before any words, like it always did. "Work's over," he said. "I know," I answered. "Then close the laptop." I closed it, without arguing, without asking why, with that absence of resistance that surprised me, and that I decided not to analyze in that moment, because analyzing would prevent me from staying, and I wanted to stay. That was the inconvenient part. We stayed an hour and a half in that bar. He spoke little, but when he did, it was real, the kind of real that doesn't exist in meetings or professional instructions. He mentioned Milan as a child, in passing, almost without meaning to, like someone releasing a word before deciding whether they want to release it. I stored everything he said with that attention I'd tried to turn off months ago, and that was operating at maximum volume that night. At the end, when I prepared to get up, his hand landed on mine on the table, slowly, intentional, without any disguise. I looked at his hand, at the fingers that covered mine with a quiet firmness that wasn't pressure but was weight, the kind of weight that doesn't come from force but from the intention behind it, and I didn't pull my hand away. "You're different," he said, as a statement, without romanticism, without the calculated inflection of a pickup line, just the sentence, direct, said as if it were a fact he'd verified and was communicating. You say that to all of them, I said, looking at his hand still on mine. I don't say anything to all of them, he answered, and I believed him, without hesitating, without needing more evidence, with that immediate certainty that appears when something is true, in a way the body recognizes before the head processes. I believed him, and that was exactly what scared me. I went to my room with my heart at a rhythm I refused to examine. I called Sophia, who screamed on the phone with an intensity that made me pull the device away from my ear, and who told me I deserved one night, just one, that didn't have to become anything. That tomorrow I'd go back to being the impeccable assistant, but that night was mine if I wanted it. I hung up. I stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes. On the second day, we both arrived at the meetings impeccable, and spent the entire day acting as if the previous night hadn't happened, with the difference that we both knew it had happened, and that this shared awareness changed the quality of every silence between us. In the afternoon, when the meetings ended, he passed by the room where I was organizing documents and said, in passing, without stopping, "Dinner at 8. Important client. Come." I went. It was work. I understood it as work. The restaurant was small, discreet, low lighting, the kind of place that doesn't appear on any list but where the food arrives before you order, and the sommelier knows the owner's name by heart. I arrived at 8 sharp. He was already there, just him. "The client?" I asked, looking around. Dante looked at me with that expression that gives away nothing and gives away everything. Cancelled. Last minute. I stopped, looked at him, at the table set for 2, at the glass of wine already poured in my place. "This was planned," I said. He tilted his head slightly, as if the answer were too obvious to need words. "You could have told me," I said. "You wouldn't have come," he answered. "True." I sat down. The dinner was conversation, real, easy, without pretense and without a laptop. The natural continuation of everything that had started at the bar the night before. He ordered the wine without consulting the menu, and knew what I'd like before I knew. I laughed at a dry comment he made about the Milanese executive from the day before, and he looked at me laughing with an expression I couldn't classify. But that stayed with me, dense and quiet, the way things that matter stay. Midway through dinner, he brought his hand to my face, slowly, without rush, his thumb brushing the line of my cheek in a touch so light, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but I hadn't imagined it, because the heat of that touch was more real than anything I'd felt in a long time. "You have a smile," he said, with the low voice he used when he wanted me to feel more than hear, "that you hide at work." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I keep thinking about it. His hand descended lightly down my neck, the tips of his fingers tracing the path with a slowness that was deliberate, stopping at my shoulder. Since day one, the heat of his hand through the fabric of my dress was a physical thing and impossible to ignore. And I was using all my available concentration to not let this show on my face in a way he could read clearly, though some part of me knew he was already reading it anyway. "Dante," I said. My voice came out different than I'd planned, lower, less firm. He responded, without moving his hand, without retreating a millimeter. "You're doing this on purpose." "Yes," he said without hesitating. "I am." The honesty of it disarmed me. It wasn't a game. It was a man who had stopped pretending. He withdrew his hand slowly, and I spent the rest of dinner trying to breathe at the right rhythm. In the car back to the hotel, the silence between us had a completely different texture from all the previous silences. Charged, aware. We both knew where this was going, and neither of us pretended we didn't know, and there was something in this mute honesty that was more intimate than anything I'd expected from that night. When the car stopped at the hotel entrance, he didn't move to get out. I looked at him. He looked back at me, and the control he always maintained, that precise and impenetrable wall, was slightly open, like a door ajar in the dark. I could see what was on the other side, and what was on the other side wasn't the cold boss or the calculated mafioso. It was the man. I opened the car door. He got out behind me. At his room door, when I was about to say goodnight and leave with what remained of my good sense, his hand closed gently on my wrist, and then he turned me toward him and kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It was deep and precise, and full of everything that had been dammed up for the last 5 months. In the touches that stopped halfway, in the looks that lasted a second too long, in the silences that carried more than silence should carry. His mouth on mine had that quality of something that finally arrived where it should be, and I lost my footing in a second, my hands on his suit by pure instinct not to fall, and he deepened the kiss with his hand on my face, his thumb on my jaw, holding with a firmness that told me he wasn't in a hurry, but there was also no more available distance between us. When he opened the room door and pulled me inside, I entered. The room was larger, darker, the entire city of Milan down below through the panoramic window. I stopped in front of the glass. He closed the door. The reflection of both of us in the window, him approaching slowly, his eyes in the mirror meeting mine before his hand landed on my waist from behind, was an image I knew I'd carry for a long time. Alessia. the first time he used my name. Not Romano, Alessia, said with a different cadence than any way I'd ever heard my own name, his mouth close to my temple, the heat of his voice arriving before any touch. If you want to leave, I don't want to leave, I said, and it was the last rational decision I made that night. What I know is that Dante Viscari in that room in Milan wasn't the cold boss or the man in a tailored suit who intimidates without needing to raise his voice. He was the man who looked at me as if he'd finally found something he didn't know he was looking for, and who touched like someone paying attention to every detail, slowly, with that precision he put into everything. But that night had a completely different temperature, and that was more dangerous than anything he'd done before. Chapter 5. The morning after it took me a few days to understand what had happened, not with the night in Milan. I understood that part, with a clarity that was almost irritatingly complete. What took me longer to understand was the sequence of what came after, and how each piece of that sequence fit into a logic that, looking back, was in front of me the whole time. I woke up before him. Milan was still dark, the buildings in points of light through the window. I lay in silence with the calm weight of what had happened. Dante slept on his side, his arm extended in the space where I had been. Less armor, more man. I got up without making noise, picked up the dress from the floor, went to the bathroom, and when I came back to the room he was awake, propped up on one elbow, his eyes already open, already looking at me with that attention he didn't turn off even fresh out of sleep. "Running away?" he said. His voice still had the rough texture of mourning, lower than normal, and there was a quiet humor in that question I didn't expect from him in that moment. "I have things to organize," I said. "Flight at 3. I know the flight time," he answered. "It's 8 in the morning." And then he got up, came to me, and kissed me with that deliberate calm of someone who's not in a hurry and isn't going to pretend to be. One hand on my face, the other on my waist, and the kiss lasted long enough to undo any argument I was building about distance and good sense and going back to being the impeccable assistant. At breakfast, in a bistro he knew from childhood, Dante was a version of himself I hadn't seen, open in a way that didn't fit in meetings or professional instructions. He asked about me, not about work. And when I said something about the meeting from the day before, he laughed. A small, real laugh, the kind I'd seen maybe twice in 5 months, and that made something inconvenient happen inside me every time. At the airport and on the flight, we worked side by side with his arm touching mine on the armrest between the seats, deliberate enough not to be an accident, casual enough not to need comment. When the car dropped me off at my apartment door, he got out with me. He stood on the sidewalk while I opened the gate, and when I turned to say goodnight, he was too close for goodnight to be enough. He kissed me again, this time briefer, quieter, his hand on my cheek for a second before letting go. Then he stepped back and said, with that low voice I'd already mapped in every possible register, "See you tomorrow, Romano," and left. I walked into the apartment with my coat still in my hand and stood in the hallway for a moment with no apparent reason, feeling something I had no name for, but that was warm and real, and that I would carry with me to sleep that night with a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't know yet that "see you tomorrow" was the last version of that man I was going to see for a long time. The next morning, I arrived at the office at the usual time. Dante was in his office, dark suit, coffee in hand, documents open on the desk, closed posture, neutral expression, eyes on the paper, everything exactly as it had been on the first day, as if the 5 months of build-up, as if Milan, as if the sidewalk in front of my apartment the night before simply hadn't existed. He looked up when I entered, looked at me for a second, the quick, assessing look of a boss checking an employee, without any of the layers that had been in that look in recent weeks. "Romano, last week's report has an error in the third quarter projection." Just that. No different pause, no different inflection, nothing indicating there was anything different between us beyond the professional relationship that had existed since day one. I stood at the door for 2 seconds. 2 seconds that were the longest I remember living in an office hallway, with that specific feeling of the ground being pulled out from under your feet slowly and silently. Then I walked in, sat down, opened my laptop. "I'll correct it by 11. By 10, he said, and went back to the documents. And that was it. I spent the day on autopilot, the version of me that functions on precise pilot when the rest is busy processing something that's not ready to process yet. I corrected the report, organized the schedule, answered emails, did everything that was expected with my usual efficiency. And when I left at 7 that night, he didn't look up from his desk. In the restaurant bathroom where I met Sophia later, I stood for 5 minutes in front of the mirror, with that quality of gaze that happens when you're checking if you're still whole and aren't completely convinced of the result. I'm just another one on his list, I said, when I came out and sat across from her. Alessia, she started. No, I said, picking up my glass with the firmness of someone closing a subject before it takes up too much space. It was one night. It's over. I'm moving on. Sophia looked at me for a moment with that expression of hers, of someone who has a lot to say and is weighing whether it's the time. She decided it wasn't. She filled her glass, stayed with me until midnight without mentioning his name once, which is Sophia's way of telling me she loves me. I moved on, or tried to. I became cold, not on purpose, but in the natural way self-preservation operates, when you decide you're not going to allow yourself the luxury of feeling something that wasn't invited. Professional at the purest, cleanest level. No conversations beyond necessary, without the extra seconds, without the attention I'd learned to give without noticing. Dante noticed the change. I saw it, in the moments when he'd stop in the middle of an instruction and observe me for a second before continuing, with that closed expression I'd learned to read, and that now I refused to read. I interpreted it as indifference. I was wrong. What I didn't know is that night hadn't been just one night for him either, that he'd stayed awake looking at the ceiling, without vocabulary for what he was feeling, and did what men like him do when faced with that, built a wall. While we both waited wrong, inside me something was changing in a way that would make it impossible, very soon, to pretend nothing had happened. Chapter 6. Lorenzo finds out. The nausea started in the 6th week after Milan. I attributed it to stress, which was real, abundant, and offered a convenient explanation for anything my body decided to do differently. I attributed it to the coffee I'd switched brands of. I attributed it to the work pace, which had increased in recent weeks with the arrival of a new project, and that kept me at the office later than normal. I had a generous repertoire of explanations and used them all, in rotation, for days. The nausea didn't pass. On a Tuesday, I bought the test at a pharmacy 2 blocks from the office and took it in the bathroom during lunch break. I sat in the stall holding toilet paper for no reason while the 2 minutes passed, with the slowness of something about to change the landscape. 2 lines. I didn't panic. Alessia Romano doesn't panic. That was one of the few certainties I maintained about myself with consistency, and it held up in that corporate bathroom stall with the same solidity as always. I stared at the 2 lines for a moment with that quality of thought that exists when your head is still processing what your eyes have already seen. Then I folded the test, put it in my bag, washed my hands, looked at myself in the mirror. The woman in the reflection looked the same as always. Fitted blazer, straight posture, controlled expression. But there was something in her eyes I recognized as the beginning of a storm that hadn't reached the surface yet, and that was going to arrive, sooner or later, regardless of how much effort I made to hold it back. I put my bag on my shoulder and thought, with the cold clarity of someone who's already survived difficult things and knows how to survive, I need to leave. Lorenzo showed up at the apartment on Thursday night without warning, like he's done since we were kids, with a plastic container in his hands that he carried with the naturalness of someone who brought food from home because he knew, without needing to ask, that I hadn't cooked anything in days. Heated it in my microwave, he said, walking in, passing straight through the living room as if the apartment were his too, which in a way it always has been. You don't eat right when you're worried. I was on the couch with my laptop on my lap. I looked up at him and said I was fine, that he didn't need to worry, that I'd eaten at lunch, the 3 usual things, in the usual order, with the usual tone. Lorenzo looked at me for 30 seconds without saying anything. I know my brother in every possible register, and he knows me the same way. 30 years of living together builds a language that doesn't need words, that operates in silences and gestures, and in the way someone holds a plastic container while looking at you. And what I saw in his eyes in those 30 seconds was the precise reading of someone who already knows something's wrong and is just waiting for me to decide to tell him. What is it? He said. Nothing, Alessia. I'm fine, Lorenzo. He put the container on the coffee table, sat next to me on the couch, and took the laptop from my lap gently. Didn't snatch it, didn't force it, just removed it with that calm movement of someone creating space for a conversation that's going to happen anyway, and prefers it to happen without obstacles between the 2 of them. He stayed silent. The silence of a brother who isn't leaving. I held out as long as I could. Which with him is never very long, I told him. I didn't plan the order, didn't choose the words carefully. Things came out in the sequence they existed inside me, which was the sequence they'd happened. The night in Milan, the morning after with the coffee in the airport, and the kiss on the sidewalk, the office the next morning, and the report with the error in the 3rd quarter, the months of his silence that I'd interpreted as indifference, and that I still didn't know how to interpret any other way. And then the bathroom on Tuesday, the 2 lines. When I finished, Lorenzo got very quiet, the kind of quiet I recognize. It's not calm, it's restraint. It's the Lorenzo who's feeling more than he's showing, and who's holding back what he wants to do to hear what I still need to say, with that discipline he's developed over the years of protecting me without smothering me, which is a difficult balance, and that he doesn't always get right, but that night he was getting it right. He got up, went to the window, stood with his back turned, shoulders slightly tense, looking at the street below for a long moment. "I warned you," he said. 2 words, without accusation. I needed that to be clear, for myself and for anyone who might be listening to that conversation. There was no, "I told you so. Why didn't you listen? Look what happened." There was only the pain of someone who was right and didn't want to have been, said in a low voice, with his back turned, with his shoulders carrying a weight I still didn't completely understand where it came from. "I know," I said. "This man," he started. "Lorenzo." My voice came out firm, with that firmness that appears when I need someone to see me in a specific way and not another. "I also made a choice. Don't treat me like a victim." He turned, looked at me for a moment with that complex expression that's anger and pain, and something else underneath that I couldn't name yet. A guilt that seemed to come from a place I hadn't accessed yet, that he was carrying for reasons I didn't know, and that he wasn't ready to reveal that night. He came to me, sat back on the couch, put his arm around my shoulders with that familiar weight that's Lorenzo's hug when he doesn't have words, which is rare, because Lorenzo always has words, and the absence of them in that moment said more than anything he could have said. We stayed like that for a moment, me with my head slightly resting, him with his arm firm, the city making noise outside as if nothing were happening in here, which is the disconcerting way the world operates when your life is turning. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. His voice had changed temperature, lower, more careful, the voice of a brother who's really asking and hasn't already arrived with the answer ready. "I'm still deciding," I said. He nodded, stayed silent for another moment. "Are you going to tell him?" he said. "No," I answered, without hesitating, without needing time to arrive at that answer, because it was already there, clear and cold. Since Tuesday in the bathroom. Lorenzo pressed his lips together, didn't argue, yet, but I know my brother, and the yet was the important part. He was saving the disagreement for a time he thought was more right, which was his way of respecting what I needed in that moment, without giving up what he was going to need to say later. We stayed 2 more hours on the couch. He opened the food container, put a fork in my hand with the quiet authority of someone who's not asking, and we stayed silent most of the time. The comfortable silence of 2 siblings who don't need to fill the space between them with words when the important words have already been said. When he left, he hugged me at the door longer than normal, harder than normal, and I thought, with the part of me that always notices the things that should tell me something before they do, that there was something in the way he hugged me that felt like goodbye, not forever, but the hug of someone about to do something he knows I won't approve of. I closed the door, stood in the hallway. I didn't know, that night, that there was reason to worry. I found out later, when it was already too late to stop it. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. My brother went to do what I never would, and Dante Viscari heard what no one else dared to tell him. I didn't know Lorenzo had gone. While I was in the apartment with my laptop open, and the resignation letter in draft on the screen, rereading the same sentence for the 4th time, deleting, rewriting, because there are words that need to be right and those needed to be, my brother was on the other side of the city, walking into the Viscari Holdings building without an appointment, and without asking anyone's permission. I found out everything only later. I found out from Marco's version, which he told me weeks later with the economy of words of someone who narrates only the essential and leaves the rest to the listener's imagination. And I found out from Lorenzo's own version, which he told me with the direct honesty of someone who did something he doesn't regret and isn't going to pretend to regret. Lorenzo arrived at reception and told the security guard it was urgent personal business. He said his own name with the clarity of someone who knows the last name will open something. And it did, though not in the way he expected. Marco Vitale, who was upstairs when the call came through, recognized the last name Romano, and for reasons he himself said he couldn't quite explain, authorized entry. Dante received him because the alternative was Lorenzo creating a scene in the lobby, and he'd calculated that before Lorenzo finished going up in the elevator. The room was silent when Lorenzo entered. Dante was behind the desk, standing, with an open folder in his hand, and according to Marco, who was at the door before being dismissed, the boss had stood up the moment the name Romano came through the intercom, with that quiet movement of someone preparing for a conversation he already knows will matter. Lorenzo walked in without shrinking. He wasn't intimidated by the suit, by the office, by the gaze that brought down anyone who hadn't learned, early on, that someone else's power isn't a reason to lose your own posture. Lorenzo had grown up on streets that teach that, with an efficiency no school can replace. "You know who I am," he said. "I do," Dante answered. His voice was low, neutral, without the weight of threat, but with the weight of someone who doesn't need threat. Sit. I'd rather stand. A pause. Dante leaned slightly against the edge of the desk and crossed his arms, not defensive, observant, with that quality of total attention he gave to anything he considered worthy of attention. And Lorenzo, from the way he told it later, felt that attention as physical pressure, but stayed standing anyway. "My sister is pregnant with your child," Lorenzo said, direct, without preamble, without build-up, the sentence in the air between them like a fact that didn't need framing. Dante didn't respond. He stayed motionless. And according to Marco, who knew the boss better than most living people, that stillness wasn't coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was a man containing a reaction that was happening too fast to be managed with his usual calm. "And you're there," Lorenzo continued, his voice hardening at the edges but not rising, not losing the control he'd arrived determined to maintain. "Behind that desk, acting like she's just another employee who's going to resign and disappear from your life without you having to do anything about it." "What happens between me and Romano?" Dante started. "Romano has a name," Lorenzo interrupted, without shouting, without aggression. Just the correction, firm and immediate, from someone who's not going to let it pass. "Alessia, and she's not okay." Dante stayed silent. "She's not sleeping," Lorenzo said. "Not eating right. She's carrying this alone while you do what? Sign contracts? Look out the window and wait for the problem to solve itself without you having to decide anything. You don't know what you're talking about. I know more than you think about men like you." A short pause, calculated, the kind that exists when someone's arriving at the central point of what they came to say. "You act like everything is yours. The office, the decisions, the people around you. But when it's time to answer for something, you pull back. You become the cold boss again, and wait for the world to organize itself around you without you having to move." Dante said nothing, and his silence, according to Lorenzo, was different from any silence he expected. It wasn't the silence of someone defending themselves internally. It was the silence of someone truly listening, and who was probably hearing that truth for the first time from someone who had nothing to lose by saying it. Lorenzo went to the door, stopped with his hand on the handle, the gesture of someone who has one more thing to say, and chose the moment carefully. "She said it was just one night for you," he said, his face to the side, his voice lower than it had been. "That she was just another one." A pause. "If that's true, tell me now, because then at least I know I need to take care of her without waiting for you to show up." Lorenzo hesitated at the door. There was something else. I saw later when I put the pieces together, that in that moment he almost said it, almost spoke about the messages he'd started receiving, about the debt that had grown in a way he couldn't hide anymore, about the name that appeared behind every collection notice, and that he'd recognized too late. But he didn't say it. He swallowed it along with everything else, and left carrying a weight I only understood when it was already too late. Dante stayed alone in the room. Marco entered 2 minutes later, like he always did when something important had happened, with the silent punctuality of someone who'd spent years learning when to enter and when to stay outside. He looked at the boss, said nothing. Dante was standing in front of the window. It was the place he always went when he needed to process something. The city below, the buildings and the movement and the scale of everything that existed outside that office, which sometimes helped calibrate the size of things and sometimes only made more evident what was inside the room. "Get out," he said. Marco left. And for the first time in a long time, for the first time in years, if he were honest with himself, and Dante Viscari was rarely honest with himself because there was rarely reason for it, he was alone with the truth about himself, with the words of a man who had nothing to lose, and therefore said everything that was true, in a sequence that left no room for the more comfortable version of the facts. You act like everything is yours, but when it's time to answer, you pull back. He thought about Alessia, about the morning after Milan, when he'd chosen to be the boss because he didn't know how to be anything else with her still in the same space, because being anything else meant admitting what had happened that night, and admitting what had happened meant not knowing what to do with it, and not knowing what to do was territory Dante Viscari had spent his entire life avoiding, with a discipline he'd confused with strength for too long. He thought about the months when he watched her close herself off, the Alessia who'd stopped giving the extra seconds, who'd made her voice shorter and her gaze more direct, and the distance between them a managed and deliberate thing, and the way he'd interpreted that as her decision, as a choice that deserved respect, as the kind of boundary that a man who doesn't know how to ask doesn't know how to cross. If you wait for her to come to you, you'll wait forever. He knew that. He'd known it before Lorenzo said it, had known it with that uncomfortable clarity that appears when you recognize a pattern in yourself you'd rather not recognize. And he'd stayed still anyway, on this side of the boundary, waiting for something to change without him having to be what changed. The suit was impeccable. The room was in order. The city below continued operating with the usual indifference of places too big to notice the decisions people make inside them. Dante stood in front of the window for a long moment, and then, in silence, without witness, he made a decision. Not to go after her, not to resolve anything yet, but the decision that comes before those, the one that needs to happen before any movement. To stop pretending that what he felt was manageable, that it was temporary, that it was the kind of thing that disappears if you give it enough space. It didn't disappear. It hadn't disappeared for months. And Alessia Romano was about to walk into that room with a letter in her hand. He knew it with the certainty of someone who knows a person well enough to read the movement before it happens. Thinking she was coming to end something, she was wrong. Chapter 8. Like it or not, you're staying. I went to resign. He told me I was pregnant before I opened my mouth, and then he said something that changed everything. The letter had been folded in my bag for 3 days. I'd written it on Friday, revised it on Saturday, reread it on Sunday with that methodical coldness of someone verifying whether the argument holds up, and it did. 2 weeks' notice, as the contract stipulated. Personal reasons, without specification, because I didn't owe any explanation beyond what the law required, and because putting the truth on paper was something I wasn't willing to do. The language was precise, polite, definitive. It was a good letter. It was the kind of letter I knew how to write. The problem wasn't the letter. It was walking into that room. I'd postponed it for 3 days with reasonable arguments, waiting for the right moment, waiting for his schedule to open up, waiting for myself to open up enough to do this, without my face giving away something I didn't want to give away. 3 days of arriving at the 10th floor with the letter in my bag, and leaving without taking the letter out of my bag, which was a form of cowardice I refused to name as cowardice, but which was, objectively, cowardice. On Monday, I woke up with the cold clarity of someone who'd made a decision and was going to execute it before the clarity passed. I arrived at the office at the usual time, greeted Carla in the hallway, got my coffee, the coffee that appeared every morning prepared just right, that I'd continued taking on autopilot in recent months, because stopping would mean explaining why I'd stopped, and explanations were exactly what I was avoiding. I held the cup with both hands for a second in the hallway, looked at his closed office door, and took a deep breath. I walked in. Dante was standing in front of the window, his back to the door, shoulders open, dark suit impeccable as always, and there was something in his posture that stopped me for half a second. It wasn't the posture of someone looking out the window from distraction. It was the posture of someone waiting, of someone who knew I was coming and chose to keep his back turned anyway, with that quality of control he exercised even over details most people wouldn't control. "I need to talk to you," I said. He turned. He looked at me for a moment without saying anything. The lingering, direct look I'd mapped in every possible register, which this time had a different temperature. It wasn't the boss's assessing gaze. It wasn't the man in Milan's gaze. It was a look I hadn't seen before and couldn't classify, which was disturbing because I'd thought I'd already seen them all. I took the letter from my bag, held it with both hands, with the firmness of someone who knows what they're doing and why they're doing it, and said, "I'm resigning. 2 weeks' notice, as per the contract." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to feel its weight. Dante didn't take the letter, didn't move toward it, didn't gesture, didn't do anything to indicate the letter existed as a physical object in the space between us. He stayed where he was, his eyes on me, and said, "Reason, personal. Romano." His voice changed temperature in a second. Didn't rise, it never rose, but gained that underlying layer that meant the instruction had ended, and what came now was different. "Reason. I don't need to. You're pregnant." The silence that came after that sentence lasted 6 seconds. I counted them, with that automatic part of me that counts things when the rest is too busy to do more than count. I didn't answer, didn't deny, didn't confirm. I stood with the letter in my hand, and the 6 seconds passing with the weight of things that can't be undone after they're said, and felt, with a clarity that arrived before any other reaction, that the ground had shifted in a way that wasn't reversible. "How do you know?" I said. It wasn't a question. It was the only sentence I could assemble in that moment, coming out lower than I'd planned. He didn't answer the question, which was an answer in itself. "Lorenzo." I knew right then, with that immediate certainty of someone who knows their brother well enough to recognize the signature of his action, even without having seen the action. The hug at the door, the goodbye that felt like more than goodbye. Lorenzo had gone, and I'd failed to notice because I was too busy looking inward to see what was happening outside. Dante crossed the room. It wasn't fast. It It was deliberate, with that slowness that isn't hesitation but is weight. The step of someone who knows exactly where he's going and isn't in a hurry to arrive because he already arrived at the decision before taking the first step. He stopped in front of me, too close to be professional, too close to be anything we could call neutral. The space between us reduced to the kind of distance that forces your entire body to be aware of the other's presence. I raised my chin. The letter was still in my hand, which I held with a firmness that was, honestly, the only thing I was controlling in that moment. "I don't want to stay here anymore," I said. My voice came out firm. I needed it to come out firm. "You have your life. I have mine." Dante stayed silent for a moment, his eyes on me. Not on the paper, not on the letter, on me. With that intensity I'd learned to recognize as the most honest version of him. The one that appeared when the control he maintained over everything loosened 1 degree and let you see what was underneath. And then he said, like it or not, each word placed with a precision that was almost physical, arriving one at a time as if it needed its own space to exist. "You're staying." I opened my mouth. "This baby is mine." 4 words. 4 words said with a low and absolute voice that wasn't threat or plea. It was statement. It was the kind of certainty that doesn't ask and doesn't request confirmation, because it doesn't need either. The voice of a man who'd made a decision within himself before entering this conversation and was just communicating what was already true for him. I looked at him. He looked back at me, and there was something in that look I hadn't seen before anywhere, in any of the versions of him I'd mapped over recent months. It wasn't the boss. It wasn't the man from Milan. It wasn't the wall he'd built the morning after and maintained for weeks. It was something prior to all of that, deeper than all of that. The version of Dante Viscari that existed before any armor, that I'd glimpsed for one night and thought I wouldn't see again. The letter in my hand suddenly felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the words I'd written with such precision suddenly existed in a different world than they existed 3 days ago. Heavier because I was still holding it and didn't know if I could let go. "You can't just," I started. "I'm not just anything," he said, without harshness, with that directness that was his way of being honest, and that I'd learned, over months, to distinguish from coldness. "I'm saying what is." "What is?" I repeated, and there was something in my voice I hadn't planned, a small crack, almost imperceptible, the kind that appears when you're holding more than you should be holding alone for longer than is reasonable. "You disappeared for months. You looked at me like I was just another employee. And now, I know what I did," he said. 3 words, direct, without defense, without explanation, without the layer of justification most people put around difficult admissions to make them more palatable. Just the sentence, clean and whole, carrying the weight of something he'd decided to stop working around. I pressed my lips together, felt my throat close in a way I refused to let show on my face. "This doesn't solve anything," I said. "No," he agreed, "but it's the starting point." The space between us had that density I knew, the density of everything that had existed since the first look on the first day, of everything that had accumulated in the following months, of Milan and the morning after, and the 6 months of distance that neither of us had crossed, and that had exacted a price I was only beginning to calculate. It was all there, in that small space between my raised chin and his eyes, that didn't look away. The letter was still in my hand. Dante looked at it for a second, the only second his eyes left me, and then returned to my face. He didn't ask, didn't extend his hand, didn't make any gesture that could be read as pressure. He stood there, too close and too firm and too real, and waited, with that new patience I hadn't seen in him before, and that reached me in a way the old control never had. I should leave. I knew I should leave. I had the letter in my hand, had the apartment 20 minutes away, had a life I'd built with my own hands, and that didn't need any man to sustain it, regardless of who that man was and how he was looking at me in that moment. I knew all of that, and I stayed, not because he ordered it, not because the letter disappeared, or because the past was rewritten, or because his months of silence suddenly hadn't happened. I stayed because there was something in that room in that moment, in that "this baby is mine" said, with a voice that didn't need volume to be the most absolute thing I'd ever heard. That was true, in a way my body recognized before my head processed it, and because for the first time in a long time, Dante Viscari had stopped pretending. Chapter 9. The Kidnapping. They took me on an ordinary day, and that's when everything that had been hidden came to the surface all at once. I stayed after the day of the letter, not because I wanted to, or at least that's what I told myself in the first weeks, with the stubbornness of someone still negotiating with their own honesty. I stayed because he made it impossible to leave, which was different from wanting to stay, which was different from admitting that the letter I'd held for 3 days might never have been meant to be delivered. The tension between us changed. There was a fragile and conscious balance, built on what had been said in that room, and on everything that still hadn't been said, and we both knew that balance was being tested every day, in ways neither of us named directly. Lorenzo showed up at the apartment on a Thursday afternoon, thinner than last time, and this time the easy smile wasn't as easy as it used to be. There were deep circles under his eyes, his shirt wrinkled in a way Lorenzo would never allow under normal circumstances, and a contained urgency he was trying too hard to hide, and that I noticed in the first 30 seconds because I know Lorenzo by heart. I'd already noticed the signs before, in recent weeks, the calls he'd answer while leaving the room, the way he'd deflect when I asked about money, the new apartment he'd said was temporary, and that had already lasted 3 months. I'd chosen not to press. I was regretting that now. The debts, I said direct. Did it get worse? I'm handling it, he said. It wasn't the usual answer. It was shorter, more closed off, and he looked away for a second before returning to me. I kept looking at him. Lorenzo, what's happening? Nothing you need to carry right now. He said this with a firmness that was new, different from the usual lightness. But I need you to take care of yourself, okay? Pay attention to what's around you. In the car, to people, that's all. You're scaring me. I'm being careful. He looked at me with that expression I only saw when the matter was truly serious. Promise you'll pay attention. I promised. Without completely understanding why, but I promised. Because Lorenzo never asked for this without reason, and because there was something in his tone that didn't leave room not to take it seriously. What I didn't know, and only found out later when the pieces fit together, is that Lorenzo had already received the threats, messages, absurd amounts, and then a photo of me taken from a distance at the office exit with a message underneath that said only, "We know who she is to you, and to him." He didn't tell me. He carried it alone, like Lorenzo always carried everything, thinking he had it under control before it reached me. The medical appointment was routine. The car that appeared at the clinic exit was identical to Dante's, same make, same color, same license plate I'd memorized out of habit in recent weeks of riding with security. It was the kind of detail that's only faked with planning, with someone on the inside providing the right specifications, with enough time and resources to execute without error. The driver waved naturally when I approached, opened the door, said my last name with the right intonation. I got in. It was inside the car that I realized. The smell was different, not the usual leather, not the air freshener Dante's driver always used, and the seat had a slightly wrong texture, imperceptible to anyone who didn't spend hours in that car every week. I did. I opened my mouth to say something, and it was too late. Fast, clean, calculated with the coldness of someone who knows chaos attracts attention and precision attracts nothing. They took from me the only thing Dante controlled, reaction time. When I woke up, I was already tied. Small room, heavy air, low and artificial light that gave no information about the time of day. Hands bound behind the chair with rope tied by someone who knew what they were doing and didn't want me to forget it. I did what I always do when the world collapses, I thought. Counted the men. 3 visible, more footsteps outside. Mapped the exits by the way sound behaved on the walls. No visible windows. 1 door with a key on the outside. Controlled temperature. Place with infrastructure, not improvised. Prepared in advance. And then I thought about the baby, felt the weight of it inside me as the only thing in that room that was truly mine, and held that awareness in the center of my chest like someone holding their breath before diving. I breathed slowly. Once, twice, with that calming technique I'd developed over years of carrying things alone, and that was working now the same way it always had. Imperfect, sufficient. And I thought about Dante, not with the naive hope of someone needing rescue, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knows the logic of a specific man, well enough to know what he'll do before he does it. This baby is mine. A man who says that with that voice, doesn't leave what's his behind. It wasn't naivety, it was calculation, and it kept me calm long enough. Lorenzo received the second photo at 2 p.m. It was me, sitting in the chair, wrists bound, alive, no visible marks, but unmistakably captive, and below the image a line of text. You know who to look for. He has what we need. Go now. We're watching you. Lorenzo went. He crossed the city with his phone in hand, and the photo still on the screen. Arrived at Viscari Holdings with the breathing of someone who'd carried too much weight for too long, and finally couldn't hold it anymore. Marco saw him enter, recognized the expression before Lorenzo opened his mouth, and took him straight upstairs without asking questions. Dante was standing in front of the window when Lorenzo entered. He turned. And what he saw on her brother's face was enough for his shoulders to close by a degree Marco had rarely seen. Talk, Dante said, and Lorenzo talked. Everything. The threats, the messages, the debt that had grown beyond what he could control, the creditors he'd discovered too late worked for Victor Sorokin, the photo he'd received weeks ago of Alessia at the office exit that he'd kept thinking he'd resolve before it reached me, and today's photo. I didn't know they'd use her, Lorenzo said, his voice failing for the first time. I swear, I didn't know this was the path. Dante stayed silent for a moment. Lorenzo described later as the heaviest he'd lived. It wasn't an explosion. It was worse. It was the containment of a man feeling more than he'd ever allowed himself to feel, compressed into a stillness that cost everything he had. And then the desk phone rang. Blocked number. Dante answered before the second ring, with the precise movement of someone who already knew what was coming. The voice on the other end was calm, the kind of constructed, instrumental calm of someone who uses composure as a demonstration of power. Dante Viscari, a calculated pause. I imagine you already know where the girl is. Dante didn't respond. His silence was answer enough. Lorenzo Romano was exactly what we needed, Victor said, with the flat satisfaction of someone reporting an expected result. His debts gave us access. His sister gave us leverage. And you, a pause, gave us the reason to use both. Dante turned his face slightly toward the window, his jaw locked. The deal is simple, Victor continued. You sign, open the roots, cede the territory we're asking for, assume Romano's entire debt. In exchange, she comes back. The deal Victor named was absurd, not for the amount, not for Lorenzo's debt, but for what it represented in territory and access. It was the kind of concession that would rewrite the balance of power between the two organizations permanently. The kind of deal Dante would never sign under any circumstance, with any pressure, under any condition. Except one. You have 2 hours, Victor said. After that, the conditions change. And I no longer guarantee anything about the state she and the baby come back in. The line went dead. The silence that remained in the room was different from any silence Marco had experienced in years of working with Dante. It wasn't anger. It was something prior to anger, deeper and more dangerous than anger. The kind of thing that happens when a man who spent his entire life protecting what was his faces for the first time, the possibility of not arriving in time. Lorenzo was pale in front of the desk, with the eyes of someone who finally understood the real size of what he'd set in motion without meaning to. Dante, he said. His voice was broken. I had no way of knowing that. I know, Dante said, low, cutting without cruelty but without room for more. He was already standing, already moving, had already made the decision Victor thought would take 2 hours to make. Marco recounted later what happened in the following 2 hours with the economy of words, of someone who lives something he prefers not to relive in detail. Dante didn't sign anything, didn't cede territory, made 3 calls to people whose names Marco didn't repeat, and that I never asked about, and in 40 minutes had the warehouse location, the number of men inside, and confirmation that Victor was operating without backing from his own organization. He was bluffing with borrowed chips, and Dante, who'd built an entire career knowing how to distinguish bluff from real threat, dismantled the operation before Victor realized that the 2-hour deadline was the only thing that had never truly existed. What happened at the warehouse before I heard the door open, I learned in fragments. I learned there were no shots. I learned Dante's men arrived through 3 entrances at the same time. I learned Victor received a call in the middle of the operation, from someone above him, and that the tone of the voice on the other end was enough for him to leave the warehouse before Dante entered. The rest was silence. The warehouse went silent suddenly. I noticed before I understood, the noise that had been constant since I'd woken up, footsteps, muffled voices, the creak of a chair outside, simply stopped, as if someone had turned off the sound of the place all at once. The silence that remained was different from the silence before. It wasn't the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a place that had just been emptied in a hurry, which is a completely different texture for anyone paying attention. Something had happened outside, and I didn't know if it was good or bad, which was the hardest part to manage. I stayed quiet, breathed slowly, concentrated everything I had on the point below my chest where the baby existed, the silent anchor that had kept me whole those hours, and waited with the patience of someone who has no option but to wait, and decided to do it without collapsing. The minutes passed with that specific slowness of time when you're paying attention to every second, and then the door opened. Dante entered first. Just him, the dark suit, shoulders open, the step I recognized by heart, but that in that moment had a different quality from all the other times I'd heard that step. It was fast without being a run. It was the step of someone who'd calculated every meter of that route before taking the first, and who was executing a plan that already existed complete in his head before starting. His eyes swept the entire room in less than 2 seconds, and arrived at me, and stopped. It wasn't immediate relief. It was something that came before relief, deeper, the reaction of a man who'd spent hours preparing for the worst, and who was processing, in 1 second, the distance between what he'd imagined and what he was seeing. Me, alive, me whole, me with my hand on my abdomen and wrists bound and gaze direct because Alessia Romano doesn't look away, even tied to a chair in a dark warehouse. He came to me without saying anything, knelt slightly in front of me, and that detail, that single gesture of Dante Viscari kneeling, reached me with a weight I hadn't expected, and that hit me before I could prepare to be hit. His hands went straight to the rope on my wrists, agile and precise, and the knot gave in seconds. When the rope released and I moved my wrists, his hands covered mine, not squeezing, just covering, with the warmth of them arriving with that quality of something you don't realize you were needing until it suddenly arrives. He ran his eyes over my entire body, checking, systematic, looking for injuries with the silent urgency of someone who'd spent hours imagining what he might find, and who still hadn't finished verifying that the worst hadn't happened. "You're okay," he said, low, to himself as much as to me, as if he needed to hear his own voice say it for it to become completely real. "I am," I answered. His hand went to my face, thumb on my cheek, eyes on mine, and there was something in that look that had never existed before in any of the versions of him I'd known. It wasn't the boss. It wasn't the man from Milan. It wasn't the wall he'd built, and that had started to give way in recent weeks. It was the man beneath all of that, without any layer, exposed in a way that was happening, because there were things that hours counted one by one, no longer let him pretend didn't exist. It lasted a second. Then he stood up, helped me stand with firm hands on my waist, and when I stood in front of him for the first time in hours, he stayed still for a moment, just looking, as if he needed the time to confirm I was really there. Really whole, really standing. In the car, the silence lasted 2 full minutes. I looked out the window. He looked ahead, with that tension still present in his shoulders, in his jaw, in the way his hands rested on his own knee, with a rigidity that was the last residue of everything he'd been holding in the last hours. "You were afraid," he said. "Yes." "Of what?" I turned my face toward him. He was still looking ahead, but there was a tension in that question I recognized as the tension of someone who needs to hear the answer more than anything else. I could have said of the place, of the situation, of the uncertainty, everything would be true, and everything would be safer than what I said. "Of not seeing you again," I said. The silence that came after had a completely different texture from the previous one. His jaw worked. The hand that was resting on his own knee moved, slowly, without announcement, and found mine in the space between the seats, and stayed. Chapter 10. The Proposal. In the car, after the rescue, he didn't let go of my hand until we got to his apartment. He didn't comment on it. I didn't comment either. It was one of those things that exist better without words around them. And Dante and I had learned, over the previous months, and in the hardest way possible, that some things lose something essential when you try to put them in a sentence. The conversation we had in the car stayed between us for days, not as an unresolved subject, as foundation. The "of not seeing you again" that I'd said with the voice that comes out different when you're telling the bigger truth. And his silence after, and the hand that didn't let go of mine. They were bricks. We didn't know yet what we were building, but we knew we were building. 3 weeks after the rescue, I was at his apartment. It hadn't been a formal decision. It had been a gradual erosion of the resistance I'd maintained for months, accelerated by what had happened, and by what had been said in the car, and by a specific afternoon when I arrived at my apartment after work, and realized the first thing I did was pick up the phone to call him, and the second thing was to look around the space that was only mine, and feel that something was missing that wasn't there. I didn't tell him that. I showed up with a medium-sized suitcase, and he didn't comment on the size of the suitcase. It was our language, but language without words has limits, and the limits appeared in the second week. There was a night when I woke up at 3 a.m., and he wasn't in bed. I found him in the living room, standing in front of the window, with his phone in his hand, and an expression that reminded me of the man I'd met on the first day, closed off, inaccessible, operating in a register that didn't include me. When I asked what had happened, he said it was work, the way he said it before Milan, the way that meant the door was closed. I went back to the bedroom and stayed awake until sunrise, asking myself if I'd made a mistake. There was the argument about Lorenzo's clinic, when I discovered the statement and confronted him, not with anger about the help, but with anger because he hadn't told me, because hiding things from me was exactly the pattern that had separated us before, and if he was going to repeat that pattern with different clothes, I needed to know now. "I paid because it was necessary," he said. "You hid it because it's what you do," I answered. The silence that came after was the old kind, the kind I didn't want anymore. He stayed quiet for a long moment, and then said, with a difficulty I saw in his jaw before I heard in his voice, "I don't know how to do it differently yet, but I'm trying." It was little, but it was honest, and I was learning that with Dante, honest was where everything started. Lorenzo was in a financial and psychological recovery clinic, the kind of program that exists for people who drown themselves in gambling gambling-related debts and need external structure not to return to the cycle, by his own choice, for the first time in his life, which was the part I was still processing weeks later, because Lorenzo had spent years being the man who solved things alone, who carried the weight without showing it, who showed up with food in someone else's microwave and smiles that were too easy and hugs that lasted a little longer than normal. The Lorenzo who had finally asked for help was a version of him I hadn't seen before, and that I was learning to recognize with that mixture of relief and pain of someone who understands that help arrived, because it arrived too late not to arrive. I visited every week, on Tuesdays, after work, with the consistency of someone who knows regular presence is different from intense presence, and that my brother needed the first. Dante paid for the treatment. I found out by accident, a statement that appeared in the wrong folder, with the clinic's name and the amount and the authorization signature I recognized without needing to verify. I stared at that paper for a long moment with something moving inside me that I didn't want to name yet, because naming meant reaching a conclusion about what it meant, and I wasn't ready for the conclusion yet. I didn't comment. He didn't comment either. It was our language. Things said without being said, understood without being explained, which sometimes were insufficient and sometimes were exactly enough. On a Wednesday night, I was on the balcony when he came home. The city was below with that late afternoon quality that turns buildings into golden cutouts against the sky, and I was sideways to the door, with my hands on the railing and my belly already visibly showing, and there was something in that moment that was quiet in a way I'd forgotten nights could be. I heard the door open. I heard the footsteps. I know them by heart now, in all registers, including the register of when he arrives and looks for me before doing anything else, which was the register I heard that night. He stopped at the balcony door, stood looking at me for a moment before coming to me, and there was something in that look from afar that I registered without being able to fully classify, the expression of someone who finds a scene they didn't expect, and who stays a second just to have it before entering it. He came, stood next to me at the railing, his arm almost touching mine, the silence comfortable for the first time in a long time. Not the tense silence of unspoken things, but the silence of two people who are in the same place and don't need to fill it with words. "Lorenzo called me," I said. "I know. He said he went to talk to you, before everything." A pause. The city made city noise below. "Said you got angry," I said. "I did, but that he was right." Dante turned his face toward me, and there was something in that expression I hadn't seen before in any of the versions of him. Not the boss, not the seducer, not the man in a suit who intimidates without needing to raise his voice. It was the man an irritating and brave brother had put in front of a mirror and who was, weeks later, still looking at what he'd seen. "He has a terrible way of saying right things," Dante said. I laughed. A small, involuntary laugh, the kind that comes out before you decide you want to laugh. And he heard me laugh, with that expression I'd learned to recognize as the expression of someone who's storing something they won't say out loud yet. The silence that returned after wasn't heavy. It was arrival. "I was an idiot," he said, direct, without dancing around it, without the layer of construction most people put around admissions that cost something. "With you, after that night in Milan. I knew what I felt and chose the wall because it was easier than not knowing what to do with the rest." "It wasn't," I said. "It wasn't," he agreed. "You never told me anything." "I know." His eyes didn't look away. "I let you think you'd been just another one, because it terrified me more than anything I'd ever felt, and I didn't have vocabulary for it. And so I did what I know how to do when I don't have vocabulary. Built a wall," I said. "Built a wall," he confirmed. "Without defense, with that directness. That was his way of being honest, when he chose to be truly honest." "That doesn't erase the months," I said. "No," he agreed, "but it's the truth, and you deserve the truth before anything else." He took something from his suit pocket. It wasn't big. It wasn't the kind of thing that announces itself. It was a simple ring, dark gold, with that quality of an object that carries history without needing to explain it. I found out later it was the style of his mother's ring, which was the only reference he had for what he was trying to do, and that he'd spent more time choosing that ring than he'd spent on any other decision in the last year. He held it between his fingers. Didn't kneel. He wasn't the type, and I didn't want him to be, because Dante kneeling would be a version of him that wasn't true, and I needed this to be true. "I don't know how to do this," he said. His voice was lower than normal, with that texture of something said to a specific person, in a specific moment, that wouldn't exist the same way in any other context. "I don't know how to have someone without turning it into control. I don't know how to love in a way that doesn't scare the other person and doesn't scare me too." I didn't speak. He continued, "But I learned one thing." His eyes met mine with that intensity that didn't look away, and that I'd learned, over months, to recognize as the most real version of him. The only thing that truly scared me was the time you were gone while I didn't know if I'd arrive in time. I held my breath. You counted, I said softly. Everyone. The weight of that arrived slowly, not as impact, but as tide, the way the most important things arrive when they're too true for hurry. Dante Viscari, who had built an entire life on control and distance, and the ability not to need anyone enough to be vulnerable to anyone, had been counting minutes. Everyone. He placed the ring in the palm of my hand, not on my finger, in my palm, with that precise and intentional gesture that was the difference between giving and offering, between deciding for me and leaving the decision with me. Stay, he said. Not because it's my child, not because I said so, because I'm asking. You hate asking, I said. I do, he confirmed, with an honesty so direct it was almost funny. This is the closest to a marriage proposal you can manage. For now, he said, and there was humor in his voice. The new humor, the one that had appeared in recent weeks when the walls started to truly give way, which was different from any lightness I'd seen in him before. I can improve with practice, I laughed. Really laughed. The loose laugh that only comes out when you're with the right person at the right moment. And he heard me laugh with that expression I'd seen once before, at the restaurant in Milan, when I'd laughed at a dry comment of his, and that now I could name. It was the expression of someone who just understood they're going to want to see that for the rest of their life. I put on the ring. You're going to need a lot of practice, I said. His hand went to my abdomen, slowly, with a gentleness he was still learning to have, that still cost him something, but that he was paying without complaining. It stayed there, warm and firm, over the belly where our child was growing with the healthy indifference of babies to all the emotional complexity of the adults around them. We have time, he said. We have time. My brother warned me on the first day, said he was dangerous, a womanizer, impossible to control. He was right about everything. He was wrong about only one thing. He thought it would make me leave. It was exactly what made me stay. What I didn't know was that by choosing to stay by his side, I was also opening the door to everything that would come after. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. The envelope arrived with no return address. I opened it thinking it was from the office. Another document, another signature. Inside were dates, records, emails I'd never seen, and a handwritten line at the end. With handwriting I didn't recognize, but that carried the kind of calm that only exists in someone who knows the damage they're causing. He didn't just know about your brother's debts. He redirected them, pushed Lorenzo onto the path that led to you being taken. Ask him why. I dropped the paper, looked at the ring, at my belly, at the office door where Dante was at that moment, not knowing I was holding proof that the man who asked me to stay was the same one who set the danger in motion. Dante hadn't rescued me from a kidnapping. He'd rescued me from a trap he himself set, and for the first time since I said yes, I didn't know if I wanted to be there. As you can see, that was just a little taste of book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments, and the complete book 2, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on book 2, and since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.